responses. So for example, when you are food deprived and you start to think about food and start to organize your behavior towards food as an end and to perceive the world that way, your body also prepares for food. And so the motivational state is an all-encompassing psychophysiological phenomena. It's not something as simple as chain behavior, which was an early behavioral theory, or as simple as something that's merely setting a goal. It's much more complicated than that. It's useful to think about, as we've already talked about with regards to psychodynamic theory, it's useful to think about a motivated state as a micro-personality. I mean, it's got one aim in mind fundamentally, so it's not particularly sophisticated, but it has all the other elements of a personality. So motivation establishes the framework within which goals are pursued and the goal itself, and then, roughly speaking, emotions, or at least many of the emotions, track progress towards goals. And so they kind of tell you whether you're on the right track or not. So that's a reasonable way of distinguishing them, even though there is no single motivation system or single emotion system. Here's some basic motivations. These are the sorts of things that Freud would have associated fundamentally with the id. So, and he thought of those as primordial, and that's exactly right, because pretty much all of these motivational systems we share, certainly with other people, also with other mammals, and then of course with animals that are farther down the evolutionary chain than mammals. So some of these systems are extraordinarily old. In fact, all of them are extraordinarily old. Hunger, consequence of food deprivation, obviously. Thirst, obviously. People are very dependent on water. Pain. Pain's complicated. There's physical pain, and then there's its mental equivalents. And the mental equivalents of pain are grief, disappointment, frustration, roughly speaking. And so the way you can think about that is, you saw the picture of the nervous system that I showed you last time with the branches going up into the brain, obviously, but with all the branches, or the roots, say, going down into the body. So we discussed the central nervous system as a sort of all-encompassing system distributed throughout the body. Imagine that part of that network throughout your body is associated with pain reception, and that would be roughly equivalent to systems registering levels of input that are high enough to potentially damage them. That's where pain seems to come in. And that different pieces of that can be activated at different times. So if it's psychological pain, as I said, grief, frustration, disappointment seems to fall into that category. Loneliness is another one. Then maybe it's primarily the cortical circuitry for pain that's activated, and although people who are depressed, for example, or who are grieving, often have somatic pain as well. And depression really looks like it's a pain state. We know loneliness is because if you take like little chicks or little kittens and you make them lonesome and they'll cry, which is or peep if they're chicks, and you can stop them from doing that by using opiates. And it's not because it stops them from vocalizing, because that would be a possibility. You just get them so stoned on, morphine that they can't peep, and you think, well, they're not lonesome anymore. So the experiments have been done carefully enough to factor out the effect of the opiates on the vocalization. So, and that's also led to some suspicion that people who have had a history of extraordinarily painful personal relationships might be those who are more prone to opiate use. And so opiates, analgesics, they basically dampen out pain and frustration and disappointment and grief and loneliness. So there's an anger and aggression system. It's complicated. There's probably two of them. One is defensive aggression. That's probably more associated with neuroticism, technically. The other is probably predatory aggression. And human beings are definitely predators. We're meat eaters, and our closest relatives, chimpanzees, for example, they're pretty good hunters. They'll gather together in packs and bring down 30-pound colobus monkeys, and the meat is very popular among the chimps. And so predatory aggression seems to be a separate circuit, and as we'll discuss further along, I think the predatory aggression circuit and the maternal solicitude circuit, because there's also a care circuit, have evolved to be at opposite ends of the same distribution. I think that's the agreeableness distribution in the big five. So on one end there's maternal solicitude, and the other end there's predatory aggression. And you can imagine how those things have to inhibit one another. Because, well, with many mammals, bears for example, the males are so predatory that you have to keep them away from the cubs because they'll kill them. Human beings, I mean, there's some aggression towards children, especially if the children aren't biological relatives, but men are pretty caring for male mammals, and women are actually quite predatory for male mammals. So thermoregulation, your hypothalamus takes care of whether you're hot or cold. Panic and escape, those are circuits that also seem to be associated with pain fundamentally, although threat can maybe trigger them as well. And the panic escape system doesn't exactly seem to be the same system as the anxiety and fear system, even though they sound roughly equivalent, right? You might think of panic as just the extreme level of fear, and I think fear can trigger panic, but panic seems to be a more primordial circuit, and if you're panicking, there's an immense impetus to escape. So that's a different circuit. Affiliation and care we covered, sexual desire. Exploration and play, both of those seem to be separate circuits. So Jack Panksepp actually, who wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, by the way, if any of you are interested in like the psychobiology of behavior and motivation, Jack Panksepp's book is one of the best. I don't have a paper by him in our collection, but he's a very smart guy. He wrote this book called Affective Neuroscience, and it's actually, given its title and the relative complexity of its thoughts, it's actually quite readable, even though it's a text. It's a little more personal than your typical text might be. And Panksepp is also very interested in psychodynamic and personality ideas, so he's a very broad thinker. And so if you're interested in an approach to psychology that sort of crosses the threshold from personality into emotion and biology, Panksepp, as well as Gray, there's a Gray paper that you're reading, Panksepp's a very, very good source. He discovered the play circuit, for example, and he also discovered that rats laugh. So if you tickle a rat, it laughs. You can't hear it though, because it laughs ultrasonically like a bat. But if you record the rat giggling and then slow down the tape, then you can tell that the rat laughs. And rats need to play, and most mammals need to play in order to socialize them. So one of the things, you can think about this when you're parents too, and this is probably especially relevant for the men, because one of the things you might ask is, what role do men play in the socialization of children? And one thing that men really do seem to do with kids is to engage in rough and tumble play, especially once they're a little older than 2, say 2 to 5 or something, and kids love that. They absolutely love rough and tumble play. Gets them so excited that, they get out of control fundamentally. But rough and tumble play is an excellent mode of socialization because it teaches the child the distinction between aggression and too much aggression, right? Because if you're wrestling with a kid, the kid has to keep their behavioral output under a fair degree of control to keep the game going, to make it rough enough to be exciting, but not so rough that they get hurt, or that they stick their thumb in their dad's eye or something like that.